Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's show. Today's guest is Eingel Hiles. Eingel is a licensed professional clinical counselor. Eingel's here today to talk to us about trauma and specifically also attachment trauma. So welcome to the show, Eingel. I'm happy to have you with us, and thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us about trauma today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, Eingel, you're here today to talk to us about trauma. So let's start off with the basics. What is trauma?
Okay, sure. So trauma, in a very simple definition, is something we experience that overrides our natural ability to cope. So it pretty much just overrides the system of natural abilities to, properly handle the situation.
Okay. So it's like an incident, an event that happens that you just can't cope with. So your natural or your usual coping mechanisms don't work. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. So that's a great question. Trauma, sometimes, I think people think it has to be some major event, and something that's traumatic to one person might not be traumatic to another. Mm-hmm. And there's no right or wrong. It's just it's how we experience whatever the experience situation is, right? So it can be, a natural disaster, a car accident, a medical procedure, and divorces can be traumatic for people. Death can be traumatic, especially if it's sudden or tragic. So again, it can be events, especially violence or anything like that. Some of the traumas that go unrecognized, that is starting to get more light and understanding, is more of the developmental traumas and the attachment trauma.
Okay.
So that is rooted in childhood. Sorry, go ahead.
And would that kind of explain, because you said that, two people may experience the same event, but they may not have the same reaction to it. They may not develop trauma from it to the same extent or in the same way. So someone may come away re-traumatized, the other person may show more resilience or better coping mechanisms.
Yes.
And would that be kind of in some ways linked to their trauma or not in childhood?
Great question. Right, it's like you already know. Yes. Yes, that's a great question of what builds resiliency, what helps, and we call them protective factors, for people to have more of a tolerance of distress. Okay. And that does absolutely factor in. So if we've had a secure attachment and a strong support system, right? Mm-hmm. Or even just a calmer nervous system, you're in a calmer temperament, something that is traumatic to one person's, or the other person's not going to be traumatized due to those protective factors. Okay. And so, but what can happen in childhood when we're focusing on the relationship between a parent and a child? The studies that were done rooted in attachment theory were more of the mother, but this could be anyone, the caregiver. So
the caregiver is the primary person that takes care of rearing the child, basically. Could be the mother, could be the nanny, could be the grandma, could be the dad.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. The caregiver. So when a caregiver is consistently and showing up to nurture the child, and also in a timely fashion, right? Mm-hmm. So when there's a need and the parent soothes the child, right, and forms the bond and is internally calm as well. Okay. So that is, a good start of creating the secure attachment.
So it's basically the parent that's responsive, so the child doesn't feel ignored or no one's coming to help when I cry for help, because this is what children ultimately do. So
yes.
Okay.
Yes. So they want to be seen, soothed, right? So Dr. Dan Siegel states, he gives the 4 S's, which we be safe, seen, soothed, and secure. So you're absolutely right. Showing up and showing that care and the co-regulation, right? Like, so that calm state helps regulate the baby. So, what that looks like in a baby would be they're able to play, right? They feel safe to be engaging with other kiddos, other infants or toddlers, right? And they will notice their caregiver, like if they leave the room, and they might even be upset, like noticing that they're gone, but they're easily consoled. Yeah. And then when the mother returns, they are happy to see them and they reconnect. Right? Okay. So in adulthood, when we have secure attachment, a person's able to be flexible, adaptable, have fun, right? Like a secure attachment allows a person to be able to handle stress and also come back down from it, right? To problem solve, to co-regulate, to allow somebody to experience their feelings and also provide appropriate empathy and compassion.
Okay, so that's the secure.
Yes, that's secure. Okay. So then the other attachments are, the first one is avoidant. The caregiver is often like tuned out, not present enough, right? And the child is left to their own devices, basically. Okay. So
can I just clarify? So just so obvious, so not present doesn't necessarily mean not physically present, but they're just not like present in the moment, right? They're not paying attention to the child and the child's needs. That's what. It can
be both.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. It can actually be both. Yes, thank you for clarifying that.
Okay.
Especially, because you can't be physically present and, mentally elsewhere and emotionally, right? So, so in adulthood, what that will tend to look like is more of, maybe more of the overly independent person and desires connection, but is scared to allow that because they don't know how to allow that because nobody was there for them growing up emotionally. Right? They tend to isolate and pretty much feel more relaxed when they're doing things on their own.
Okay.
Because it is terrifying to them to think that another person can meet their needs because they have done it on their own their whole life, but really they don't know how to get their needs met, right? They don't know how to ask for help. Okay. They feel bad for asking for help.
Okay.
And so it's very lonely. So it is very hard to attune to them and co-regulate because they tend to be walled off a bit.
Okay. So because
they let people you're going to hurt me. I don't trust you, basically.
Okay. So that's avoidant.
And we call that dismissive in the adult attachment.
Okay.
But avoidant as the child.
Okay. So the child is avoidant and becomes dismissive as they grow into an adult person.
Yes. And so additionally, in the adult relationship, when we say dismissive, so they're not able to recognize the emotions in other people a lot of the times, right? Okay. Like, so you kind of feel like they present as closed off. Like, what do you mean? You really just can't attune together, or does that make sense? It's just always off somewhere because they are not comfortable with their internal world and emotions, so they don't know how to be there for somebody else for them to experience their emotions.
Okay.
This system that we have, this social engagement system, like we are created to be in connection with one another, right? And when we don't have that, and that is foundational, it is everything for healthy development, right? So when there's an injury there, what starts to happen is we adapt to that, right? We accommodate. And all of this is typically beneath our awareness.
Mm-hmm.
We just are in survival mode. So it's subconscious living until these things come to light later.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, unfortunately, change only occurs when there's enough negative consequences in our life and enough pain that we have to say, ooh. And I think it's helpful then as adults when, to have compassion and empathy for people that have behaviors that aren't desirable, that aren't welcoming, that seem to be hurtful, right? So a lot of those things can trigger our stuff sometimes, or, it's counterproductive with people with this attachment style because they are desiring connection and intimacy. Right. So, and they're not also able to recognize their part because of the injury that's so deeply underneath their awareness.
We've got secure, we've got dismissive. Anything else you'd like to add about dismissive before we move on?
No, we can move on.
Okay.
Okay. So the next one is ambivalent or anxious attachment. And then in the adult attachment, it's considered preoccupied. And so this is kind of the opposite of the avoidant. So what happens with this attachment is the caregiver is inconsistent.
Okay.
So sometimes I'm present, and timely and attuned and, all of those things. And sometimes I'm not. So it's, are you going to be there? Or aren't you? Are you going to be there? Or aren't you? And so we get anxious, right? Or even, again, that internal state, if our caregiver is anxious and doubting their abilities as a parent, the infant can soak that up. Okay. And so sometimes, in adulthood, or as not even just in adulthood, clearly we age through adolescence and everything. So all the while experiencing relationships are just this anxious state because everything is like unsure, right? Are you or aren't you? Are you or aren't you?
Yeah.
And I just feel uneasy inside of me. So now I create this adaptive style of focusing outside of myself, right? And I'm now worried about others, right? And their needs.
I'll just quickly like to go back to childhood, so how that develops, and then go back to like what it does to us as adults. But basically, as a child, you've mentioned like, ambivalent parenting. I'm here, but I'm not here, maybe present today, not present later. But also I'm now thinking kind of like, I love you this moment, I don't love you the next. I'm really loving and giving now, and in the next minute I'm exploding and like, just like with rage and, yelling, or even worse. So does that fall within the same category that would create, like ambivalent attachment, or is that like reserved? Is that too severe and it would be reserved for another category?
It's actually a little bit of both. So more of the explosive behaviors that does come next in the disorganized, where it's fear. But you are correct in the ambivalent, where right, the state of the parent is so unpredictable, or in the behavior, right? Like, so we tend to think, ooh, what's going on? Especially as a child, we don't really have to. We're not thinking yet, it's feeling. So that is the state of the infant. And when these moments happen, if we're picking up on that, so subconsciously, when we continue to grow with that parent, there's an association that has been made that, when I need to get my needs met, I'm feeling anxious. So, but if I behave in this way, then mom seems to be calmer, right? Like kind of the walking on eggshells term. So that's that tends to happen. And then we kind of fall in that role of people pleasing, or, basically always attuned to other people's feelings, but not in tune to ourselves. So we really don't have a sense of self as an anxious attachment. And we're just attuned to others people's feelings and not so much of our own. So putting others' needs ahead of our own, but feeling resentful about it, right? Like we are too scared to state what we think or feel because we're scared we'll be abandoned, basically, right? Like that you're going to leave, you're not going to show up because, right? Because sometimes you weren't there. Again, if this was created, that blueprint was created in childhood, it's scary to actually say what we need and think or want and feel and all of those things. So that's where that kind of behavior kicks in, where if we do, that creates even more anxiousness that the other person may leave. And sometimes people with this attachment style will end relationships quickly, or I wouldn't say maybe not even quickly, but they'll end them what's that?
Prematurely?
Yes, exactly. As a self-protection, to avoid a possible abandonment, right? So it's always protection mode. And in both of these, in the avoidant and then also the anxious, right? Because trust and safety has been broken. So all these adaptations are survival.
Someone who's preoccupied, obviously, like they're worried about kind of being rejected or being abandoned. And then like they might like end a relationship prematurely out of this fear of being rejected or abandoned. But then really like what they're doing is they're ending the love that they might actually need. And is that like the logic for them? I'd rather end it because then I'm in control and I wasn't abandoned and I wasn't rejected because I was the one who did it.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly right. And there might be a false logic there, but the story that they've created more subconsciously than anything, right? That this has been my strategy to survive. Right? Yes. Very good. And these individuals that have this attachment style will also, it can be demanding.
Emotionally demanding.
Yep. And because of this anxiousness that you're stating too, need for control because things feel so out of control because they're so unpredictable. So they're looking for ways, and they can ask maybe over and over, because they're in tune and hypersensitive to other people's emotional states and want to fix them and want to make them right. Or I need you to be, this way, and just kind of more focused on what's not there, what's wrong, rather than being able to receive the love and connection that may already be there, but they're so focused on it not being there.
So on a very, very basic level, someone who's in constant need of hearing, I love you. So like they constantly ask you, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you as if like something, something had changed from the last time you said it, like a few hours earlier. Would that be kind of like a sign of someone being preoccupied?
Needing that reassurance. Sure. Because, their survival mode was rooted in this. Like, are you going to be there? Are you going to be there?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well,
does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, okay. So these are the first three. The last attachment style
is disorganized. And this one is tricky because our social engagement system, our stress response system that we're talking about is, again, the fight or flight response and our ability to form close relationships, right? The attachment. So when this is hijacked, if you will, and parents or caregivers have been unpredictable and violent or abusive and neglect, right? Like the terror that we experience as a child when we observe that. So now that fear is stuck, basically, it's in our nervous system, and we desire closeness, but we're also terrified. So the system doesn't, it's like, I do and I don't, I do and I don't. So you're going to see anxious and avoidant in different situations, right? And basically the heart rate, like it's just such a challenging state to be in, because there's so much going on within the internal world. So it just shows up in different ways sometimes. It's more situational, maybe when the anxious attachment is more prevalent than the avoidant, or vice versa. But they are able sometimes, to have secure attachment as well. It just they're always situational of when these wounds will be highlighted.
Okay. Especially if they've suffered violence, I'm thinking, or neglect as children, may they be more explosive, kind of as adults themselves, or, I don't know if that question is making sense.
Yeah, no, you ask great questions. So yes, actually, so you could see emotional outbursts, angry outbursts. A lot of the times those behaviors are, experienced as an adults because we observed them, experienced them as children. Doesn't mean that will happen, right? They could internalize, they might not act out, but they may have emotional meltdowns, or maybe then they just shut down, right? It can be different for each person, right? But the main part is that they're disoriented, right? They're not typically able to self-regulate or co-regulate. The nervous system is very, if you will, fried. It's just, it takes a lot of work to help soothe and regulate and repair that. And the challenging part with that is due to how extensive the injuries were. So the terror, the fright may prevent individuals to ever look at themselves, because it's just so scary. And this is the only thing they know of survival. So it is possible in all of these to heal and be able to form secure attachments. So that, going back to the beginning question, to know that all of this, every aspect, can be healed through mind-body practices and being able to self-soothe and learning how to identify our internal world and our feelings, and get to a level where our emotions are tolerable. Okay? So rather than when a person has experienced trauma, they wake up in a state that is more alert than a person that doesn't have trauma.
Okay.
So a person without trauma wakes up in a very calm state, right? And it might take them a lot more stressors of the day to have a moment where they experience distress, right? And are out of their window of tolerance, is what we call it. And so a person with trauma and unresolved trauma, more specifically, and especially complex trauma, is more of, if we have developmental attachment, maybe other traumas, right? Repeated traumas, which can happen throughout a lifetime if it goes unresolved, by the way. So with that, it's not going to take much at all. And basically with trauma, the lens is distorted. So we think the world is scary, right? We don't feel safe in our bodies anymore. So the day when we wake up is already, scary.
What would it look like if someone came into your clinic and said, help, I can't cope with this anymore? What would therapy look like?
Well, the first thing is creating awareness. So clearly, if the person is recognizing I need help, that's the sign, that's the great first step, is recognizing that something isn't right. So sometimes what I was saying before that, though, is sometimes a person won't ever get to that space to recognize something isn't right. And then I would say being open and willing to be open to the process, essentially, right? Because an understanding of the process is that sometimes we have to feel worse to feel better, right? So acknowledging these painful aspects of ourselves that we've put away, right? And slowly allow ourselves to feel these feelings that we were never permitted or able to experience as children, right? So we create a very safe, predictable space and emphasize the relationship, the therapeutic relationship, so a person can feel regulated. And that may take some time, even just that period, right? Because they are building trust. So building trust is the first step, because that's what is needing to be repaired. But through that, I like to teach these calming strategies and mindfulness training that helps the integration process, right? And we can do that through a number of ways. Sound healing, meditation, body movements is really important. More of the ancient practices, they have a lot of healing properties because trauma lives in the body. We really can't process it through words. And so the studies have been showing lots of effectiveness through these practices, right? And then when the body starts feeling safe, because trauma also disconnects the mind and the body, right? So if we're more focused on survival and others and scanning, right? We're always scanning for safety. We're not very present. So these practices calls us back into our bodies and in a moment of the now where life is taking place. So it's really just rebuilding that and going back to experience what we needed to experience as children and basically rewire and reprogram our belief system, right? To know that we all have worth. Nothing separates us from our worth. Right? It's not conditional. And we tend to think that we have to be a certain way to have or receive love. And that is untrue.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I love this holistic approach that you've got to therapy and this connecting of the mind and the body. Because we do tend to I think traditional psychology, for example, does tend to disconnect the two. And I do think that our ancestors, our perhaps Eastern ancestors, had it right in many ways, this connection between mind and body. And I know from looking at your Instagram page, for example, that you also work with breathing exercises, all of that. And that is, it's just so basic, but yet so forgotten about in our day-to-day life, and just basically how working with what you've got already can take you a long way, without ending up on someone's couch, if you know what I mean. So
I really love how you put that. We do have everything we need within ourselves, right? And that is my holistic, approach and how I see well-being in every individual, right? And yes, in therapy, we tend to have to diagnose, but I'm not a fan of that, because that, I think that keeps people from exploring themselves, because they don't want to have something wrong with them, or, a diagnosis, and it's pathological rather than, what went wrong, what is lacking. And I do feel most of it is, if it's not rooted in trauma, it's more of just lacking skills, right? So if we weren't taught how to experience emotions, relationships, we're not going to know how to effectively do that. So what do? We rely on what we saw or what we know, and we just are surviving rather than consciously living and embracing who we were created to be.
So thank you for that, Angel. Is there anything else you would like to share with us before we say goodbye to you today?
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And I guess I just want to give hope to people, because you can heal. I mean, I'm living proof. This is very personal to me, this journey, and I'm just so blessed to be able to share my healing and my expertise, or, knowledge, my lessons with others, and help them feel and achieve well-being and have a vital, healthy life and be the people that we're created to be.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you very much, Angel. And we hope to see you again on the channel. There's so much still to talk about, which I think we'll do in another episode. So thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you.